at NATO. NATO, where he spent the last 10 years out in different missions, different positions, always linked to cybersecurity or cyber defense. And Christian-Marc Lifländer, before of that, occupies also some very key position in the government of Estonia, I'm sorry, his country of origin. So, Christian-Marc, I give you the floor, and it's a pleasure to have you here coming from Brussels to explain us a few things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. So, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, let me start by saying that I'm very much delighted to be here in Geneva and here at the Press Club. It has been a while since we've been together in person, pandemic and everything. I can tell you, it sometimes feels like this virtual thing was like eating canned food. It filled your stomach, but wasn't the real thing. I think very much this is about this interaction. We are social animals after all. So it's good to be back, and I'm also grateful to be part of this discussion here in Geneva, looking at lessons learned from the use of cyber in the 21st century conflicts. Let me also say from the outset that we usually stand where we sit. And while I sit in front of you today, my day job is basically at the NATO headquarters, and this is me telling you that my remarks are very much influenced by the work that I do. Let me also sort of stress before I get on with the keynote that this event, I think, comes at an unprecedented time. I think we face a profoundly changed security environment. Cyberspace has been central to the war in Ukraine. It has been used to shape the battle space. Cyber attacks were used to lay the ground for the invasion, to disable Ukrainian communications, and the ability for the government to communicate with its people, and to distort the narrative through disinformation. In recent months, you have also seen cyber attacks with data wiping malware continuing to target Ukrainian entities in government, commercial, and energy sectors to paralyze computer systems. It was mentioned already in the panel this morning that some of this malware has had cascading effects and indeed impact beyond Ukraine's borders. The hack on the KSAT satellite network, for example, affected internet connectivity for tens of thousands of people across Europe. Of course, as you have seen, many NATO allies have attributed this attack to Russia, condemning the attack in strongest terms. We have also seen failed attempts to disrupt the Ukrainian power grid, which could have left millions of people in the dark. And in recent days, we have seen further warnings from many governments against potential cyber attacks against our national critical infrastructure in response to support provided to Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia. So given this moment in time, I wanted to reflect on two main themes, also to set the stage for the panel to follow. First, on the strategic importance of cyber for current and future conflicts, because I think what is important is to get the thinking right, to understand the cyberspace for what it is, and really draw relevant policy conclusions out of it. And second, very briefly, I'd like to look at how cyber is used in Ukraine, given its sort of proximity to this event, and I think also significance for further policy work. But first, if you allow some observations regarding the world around us in order to understand the strategic threat landscape. Now, it is clear that the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace. Russian Federation has violated the norms and principles that contributed to a stable and predictable European security order. Right now, we cannot discount the possibility of an attack against allies' sovereignty and territorial integrity. What you see is strategic competition, pervasive instability, and recurrent shocks that define our broader security environment. The threats we face are increasingly global and interconnected. We find our interests, values, and democratic way of life challenged. In Indeed, strategic competitors test our resilience and seek to exploit the openness, interconnectedness, and digitalization of our nations. We have seen interference in our democratic processes and institutions and targeting the security of our citizens through hybrid tactics, both directly and through proxies. We've seen conduct of malicious activities in cyberspace, disinformation campaigns, instrumentalization of migration, manipulation of energy supplies, and employment of economic coercion. And, perhaps not surprisingly, many of these actors are often also at the forefront of a deliberate effort to undermine multilateral norms and institutions and to promote authoritarian models of governance. So what does this mean, particularly for the cyber discussions that we're having here today? I think the challenge is this long-term strategic competition with actors that have become quite skilled at operating below the threshold of armed conflict to advance their strategic interests. As discussed, I think you see many of these actors taking careful steps to design around deterrence and trying to pursue their strategic interests in areas with blurred thresholds of tolerance. You see conduct of deniable, hostile actions that seek to undermine trust and confidence in democratic institutions, social fabrics, and the global economic system. And I think to take away from here is that, and what is of critical importance to me, is that these operations that I just listed, short of armed conflict, can have cumulative impact at the strategic level. It's not necessarily a single blow, but a death by 1,000 cuts. Put simply, these operations over time can degrade or damage sources of national power. All nations and organizations that are dependent upon cyberspace will therefore be affected. What this means, perhaps also from an academic perspective, is that we need to see cyberspace for what it is, a contested space. Unlike other domains, it is always on, right? And this has very far-reaching consequences. There is constant friction and continuous activity, a blurring of the lines between peace, crisis, and conflict. In other words, you're not dealing with a hypothetical cataclysmic event that comes once in a century, but a permanent contestation. And I think these unique characteristics should challenge our traditional thinking, particularly, I think, as it applies to deterrence. It is not possible to prevent and deter all cyber activities, so we need to shift our thinking towards a more proactive approach. Cyberspace is a means to achieve strategic effects. With that scene set, let me now turn to Ukraine. After Russia invaded Ukraine, what I saw was many observers initially expecting cyber attacks to take the limelight as a major instrument in Russia's arsenal. But after many months of fighting, a host of prominent scholars and analysts seem to have reached the opposite conclusion. Russia's cyber effort, they claim, has been trivial, or sometimes even non-existent. What I also see is that many have dismissed the role of cyber operations, firstly proposing that digital preparations for the invasion in Ukraine really never occurred, were haphazard, or lacked any real impact, or sometimes that they were just a continuation of Russia's long-term cyber activity against Ukraine that fell below the threshold of outright war. Let me point it out that I think this is a very dangerous misdiagnosis. All available public evidence indicates that Russia has employed a coordinated cyber campaign intended to provide its forces with an early advantage during its war in Ukraine. The apparent disconnect between observed incidents on one hand and really the public analysis that Russian cyber operations have been minimal on the other hand, to me at least, is quite surprising. I think the preconceived notions of the role of cyber attacks on the battlefield have made it hard for many to see cyber operations in Ukraine for what they really are and the role they play within Russia's military campaign. I think if there's one thing to take away from it, then it's this. And this is important because I think leaning on these preconceptions will lead to poor future policy decisions. cyberspace, to me, is still a very nascent domain of operations, and events in Ukraine will likely have outsized implications, not just for any appreciation of Russia's cyber power, but for an understanding of the nature of cyber conflict itself. And let me quickly walk you through my thinking here. The belief that cyber operations have played no role in Ukraine does not stem from a lack of real-world impact. To the contrary, the magnitude of Moscow's pre-kinetic destructive cyber operations was unprecedented. On the day the invasion began, Russian cyber units successfully deployed substantial amount of destructive malware, including against conventional military targets, such as civilian communications infrastructure and military command and control centers. And when I looked at it, the cumulative effects of these attacks were striking. In the hours prior to invasion, Russia hit a range of targets in Ukraine, rendering the computer systems of multiple government, military, and critical infrastructure sectors basically inoperable. Forensic analysis by Microsoft, Symantec, ESET, and many other companies have found that these attacks affected multiple government agencies, military institutions, civil emergency services, and a range of other critical infrastructure sectors, such as defense industrial base manufacturers. Indeed, Russia still continues to draw from its wartime arsenal of cyber tools, continuing to deploy additional destructive malware. Cities under siege from Russian shelling have experienced cyber-enabled disruption to internet services. And Ukraine's national cyber authorities continue to expose intrusion attempts by Russian cyber units. All of this has occurred against the backdrop of a series of website defacements, denial of service attacks, and other destabilizing cyber operations intended to produce chaos and further exhaust Ukraine's cyber defenses. What does it mean? I think the challenge here is that viewed as isolated events, the scale and strategic significance of Russia's cyber offensive may get lost in the conventional violence unfolding in Ukraine. But a full accounting of Russia's cyber operations, I think, reveals a proactive and persistent use of cyber attacks to support its military objectives. The misperception that Russia has been restrained or ineffective in the prosecution of its cyber war in Ukraine likely stems from the fact that Russia's cyber operations have not had a standalone debilitating effect that some pre-conflict assessments imagined they would have. And here's sort of the main idea. I think it is sort of unrealistic test of strategic value to expect cyber to deliver that decisive blow. No single domain of operations has had an independent, decisive effect on the course of any war. Nevertheless, the lack of overwhelming shock and awe, as it sometimes is referred to, in cyberspace, I think has led to this flawed presumption that Russia's cyber units are incapable, or even worse, that cyber operations have offered Russia no strategic value in its invasion of Ukraine. Now, it is a fact that Russian cyber units did attack a range of targets in accordance with Russia's war plans. Russian cyber attacks on government and military command and control centers, logistics, emergency services, and other critical services such as border control stations were entirely consistent with their strategy intended to stoke chaos, confusion, uncertainty, and ultimately avoid a costly and protracted war in Ukraine. Indeed, when I look at it, Russian cyber units have demonstrated their ability to succeed without adequate warning and direction, and all of this despite the overarching issues elsewhere across Russia's military effort. So it is important to understand, once again, that the reason for this lies in the unique nature of competition and conflict in cyberspace, as I discussed earlier. Unlike troop buildups and other forms of military mobilization that are infrequent and highly visible, cyber operations are a result of operational cycles that occur covertly and continuously through peacetime and wartime. So it is not a binary proposition. The targeting of sensitive networks during peacetime lets attackers lay the groundwork for malware intended for wartime use. The methods that attackers use to establish initial footholds for espionage activities are also indistinguishable from those that precede cyber attacks. To put it bluntly, for cyber units, war does not fundamentally change the way they prepare or start to fight. In conclusion, I think a clear-eyed view of the role cyber warfare has played so far in Ukraine and a better understanding of its place in modern warfare are paramount. It's important that we get it right. Cyberspace is an area of strategic competition and conflict between states. And I will put it to you, it can only be defended and secured in a collaborative spirit. Cyber means can achieve effects and may not necessarily take the form of shock and awe events, but through more insidious and persistent campaigns that quite often take years. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, the importance of cyber as an enabler and a complement to traditional kinetic war, I think, became apparent. But it is also a domain where effects can be achieved in their own right, and you need to think about it that way. Finally, cyberspace is a shared space with many actors, not just governments. During the war in Ukraine, we have seen the private sector take up a critical role in defending against cyber attacks. Now, I know we've been talking about public-private partnerships for years, but the events of the last months, I think, truly have seen a new level of engagement between public and private sectors to advance international peace and security. And here, what I'm really talking about is partnerships that span civilian and military fields, public and private sectors, and national and international spheres. Defending our values and rules-based international order is a collective effort. So too is building capacity and helping others to shore up their defenses. And of course, perhaps not surprisingly, engagement across public and private sectors. I mentioned earlier the important role many private sector actors are playing right now in Ukraine to respond to incidents, sharing information, ensuring backups of data, and keeping systems up and running. And I find this engagement truly remarkable. I think it goes without saying that this aspect needs to be further embedded within our longer-term approach to tackling persistent malicious cyber activities and campaigns for years to come. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian-Marc Lifländer.